to this second discussion on the travels of Abu Talib Khan, Mashar-e-Talibi. Now, yesterday, when we started with Abu Talib, we had made quite a number of points referring to the circumstances under which Abu Talib traveled to England, his having come to Ireland, and then we had also talked about the publication history of Abu Talib's travels, especially the way in which, Abu Talib sort of became quite famous in England, and how his travels were, translated into both written in Persian, circulated in Persian, and also translated into English. So with that background, let me once again also talk about a brief, recollection of the theory through which I will sort of enter Abu Talib, and that is that of Mary Louise Pratt's Imperial Eyes, where Pratt talks about the contact zone, where disparate cultures in asymmetrical power relations come in contact with each other and grapple with each other. Transculturation is the way in which, the colonized take certain aspects from their from the other, and thereby change their selfhood. And finally, autoethnography is that kind of writing which sort of seeks to write the colonized in their own terms. So using the strategies of the colonizer, the colonized responds by writing himself in his own terms. So now when we look at Abu Talib's travels, we will see how this process of contact zone, autoethnography, and transculturation takes place within the travelogue. Now, for the sake of convenience, what I've done is I've taken selections from the text, which I now want to sort of, as it were, project on the screen so that you can, have a look at the texts or the segments of the texts that I am trying to take a look at. But remember that these are not the only texts that, only parts of the text that I'd like you to also look at. I would also like you to look at other parts of the text and read the travels in its details. But for the time being, let me share my screen so that you can have a look at the kind of sections that I want you to emphasize. Now, this is the text that I'm sort of projecting, and I will begin with his arrival in Ireland, especially when he comes into contact with Richardson once again, arrives in Ireland, and then meets Baker and Dean Muhammad, whom he sort of says will follow a later course of being the shampooing surgeon. But it is in Ireland that, Dean Muhammad, Abu Talib comes into his own, really. Now, you will remember, of course, that I had mentioned, according to Shimonti Shen and Nigel Leask, both of them talk about how, the binaries of the colonizer and the colonized do not really work for Abu Talib. Because, you see, post 1857, when, the colonized Indian is conscious that he's in the waiting room of history, as it were, as Mill sort of wrote and Dipesh Chakraborty so brilliantly points out, that modernity is a preserve of the West and that the Indian has very little access to it. Abu Talib, on the other hand, responds to the West with a much more equal footing of equality. And at the same time, he also recognizes how the English are, as it were, looting India, and how the resources of the English are based on India. Therefore, what he does is he visits Ireland and notices that Ireland too is a colony of the British. So there is a kind of identification with the Irish that Abu Taleb makes. And let us take a look at how he presents the Irish vis-a-vis the English. And therefore, he talks about the character of the Irish. And you see how, Abu Talib has now taken on a kind of the selfhood of the person who's very self-conscious about his position of judgment. So this is for the first time really that he's judging the English and the Irish taken together. And he says that the greater number of them are Roman Catholics. And look at that phrase here. If you see my cursor, they are not so intolerant as the English. Right? So Abu Talib is clearly making a distinction between the intolerant colonizer and the tolerant Irish, and thereby creating a kind of a bond between the Irish, the colonized Irish, and the colonized Indian. Neither have they the austerity and the bigotry of the Scots. In bravery, in determination, hospitality, and prodigality, they surpass the English, but are deficient in prudence and sound judgment. So Abu Talib is locating the Irish within a realm of a greater sympathy and a greater fellow feeling, much more than the English. So the English are essentially seen within the travels, even though they are, in terms of Abu Talib, extremely superior culture in terms of technology, they're seen as somewhere intolerant and lacking sympathy. And then he talks about the landlady and many of my friends becoming affected and saying, with your little knowledge of the language, you'll suffer much distress in England. And this is also another interesting thing, that you see, the identity between the Indian and the Irish is based on one of affectation and feeling rather than one of rationality. So Abu Talib is bringing in two kinds of discourse here. One is the discourse of rationality, technology, where he sees the English as superior to the Irish and Indians, of course. But the other is the discourse of affectation, fellow feeling, in which, the English are inferior to the Irish and therefore to the Indians as well. And see, in the way in which language is a barrier for Abu Talib, the Irish are much more sympathetic towards his language rather than the English. So the English are seen as essentially distant, essentially non-emotional. So in terms of the Lockean empirical thesis, the English are superior. In terms of the discourse of sentiment and sensibility, which we talked about when we did our 18th century classes, Abu Talib considers the Irish and the Indians to be superior. So it's this, yardstick of judgment that he sort of brings in when he talks about the Irish. And he talks about the Irish and their fellow feeling, how a person from Ireland Dublin would immediately quit his work and show him the way, and how, he would sort of insist that he take care of them. And then he talks about how the Irish, because of this kind of a behavior, are not very well off as their English counterparts. Apart from this, of course, you see, there is a certain Muslim personhood or selfhood in Abu Talib, a Muslim religious Shia personhood, through which he looks at the lens of the West. Now, in terms of this selfhood, and Abu Talib being a devout Muslim, he looks at the Irish critically in terms of their habit of drinking, right? So in terms of religion, even if the Irish are akin to the Indians and the Muslims because of their devoutness to the Roman Catholic Church, in terms of drinking, Abu Talib judges them very unfavorably, right? So he talks about the immense quantities of consumption of a fiery spirit called whiskey, right? So whiskey at this point of time is an alien drink to Indians, so which is the peculiar manufacture of this country and part of Scotland. And he talks about how a gentleman is actually sort of starting drinking from the afternoon and goes on well into the night. And then he talks about, very interestingly, a caricature, the figures of the caricature, and he talks about the caricature of the Englishman. And this Englishman is represented as a fat bull, and therefore named John Bull. And as that animal is remarkable for eating a great deal and for excessive courage and obstinacy, so the English seem to consider eating and drinking as their chief happiness, are frequently blunt and uncouth in their manners, and often run into danger and unnecessary expense. Now, you will find that when you read your Rabindranath on the ship will also encounter one such John Bull who will bully Rabindranath. And therefore, by bringing in this caricature, Abu Talib is making clear that the travelogue is not an unblemished admiration for the British, but rather an extremely judgmental, critical account of the behavior of the British, which is seen as, in many ways, inferior to the Irish. Right? You see, what happens is, as Abu Talib travels from the mainland into English culture, Ireland becomes a kind of a stopover for him. And in identifying more with the Irish than the British, Abu Talib seems to create a kind of bond, or indicate a kind of bond that exists between the two cultures that are dominated by the English. Now, before I move on to his encounter with the king, however, Abu Talib makes an interesting point that when he sort of arrives in England, then he stays at a particular street. And this is not a very well-known street. In fact, it is known for its prostitution. But once Abu Talib is established there, he kind of describes the way in which different noble men and noble women, they visit him in that particular street. So there is a very conscious status that he puts on himself as the Persian prince. And it's very ironical, incidentally, because when Abu Talib has actually arrived in England, or he set off for England rather, he was a pauper. But once he arrives at England, he takes great pains in underlining the fact that he is a celebrity, an Oriental celebrity, as it were. Now, we will come to this point a little later on, and we'll take a look at how, and why Abu Talib is framed as this Oriental. But I would now move on to his interaction with the king. And he goes, visits the king with Mr. Dundas and the gracious, majestic Queen Charlotte. Both of these illustrious personages received me in most condescending manner, and having honored me with some conversation, commanded me to come frequently to court. And once this happens, Abu Talib says, after this introduction, I received invitations from all the princes, and the nobility vied with each other in their attention to me. Hospitality is one of the most esteemed virtues of the English, and I experienced it to such a degree that I was seldom disengaged. So he becomes an important celebrity in his own right in England. But why did Abu Talib become this celebrity? That is a question which we need to answer. Now, to answer this question, I would also like to go to another episode which Abu Talib describes, and that is, which I, of course, have not put in this textual selection, but you can take a look in the proper text, is his visit to a masquerade. Now, the masquerade was a kind of a ritual event, a kind of a public spectacle that took place in the gardens and in the parties where people would go dressed in an alien costume. So the nobility could go in as a chimney sweep, or it could go in as dressed as a hospital patient. And when Abu Talib goes to these masquerades, he finds that a large number of people come dressed in oriental splendor. So you see, this is the time when, within the British imagination, the exploits of the East India Company has created India as a land of an exotic religion, a land of exotic people, which is marked by wealth. So the exotic nobility, which has been framed by the Orientalism, or which is being framed by Orientalism, draws a degree of fascination for the Britisher. So this fascination works its way into the masquerade where the Englishman dresses as an Oriental nobility. At this point of time, therefore, the Oriental gaze, as it were, is looking out for these marks of splendor. And in comes Abu Talib, who actually exemplifies the other in the way that the Oriental would like to see him. Noble, dressed in robes, clothed, polished, quoting Ghalib, quoting the Persian poets, a Persian scholar, and therefore a perfect Oriental figure. And therefore Abu Talib becomes, a kind of masquerade in reality. The masquerade which is now becoming real. And therefore he becomes an object of the gaze which frames him as the Oriental. Right? So the exotic Oriental. And notice the paradox, as it were, that Abu Talib is not a Persian prince. He hardly, has any wealth before he comes to England. But when he comes to England, he's framed as this, opulent, magnificent Oriental prince, Persian prince, who becomes the subject of the British gaze. So there are two gazes operating here, you must understand. One is the British gaze, which seeks to fix Abu Talib within a particular discourse of Orientalism. And that is what the ethnographic gaze would be like. The other is Abu Talib's gaze, which takes a very careful scrutiny of British society, looks at the ways in which it is marked by a superiority over the Indian conditions, yet very critically also looks at the defects of the English at the same time. Therefore, this is the process of autoethnography. Now, Abu Talib wants his Muslim brethren in India to change themselves and adapt the technological prowess of England. In that, he seeks transculturation. But there are certain zones where this transculturation is prohibited, where he refuses to, accede any Western superiority. And these are two zones. One is in the zone of religion, where he considers his Muslim religion to be far superior. And secondly, in his discourse of women, where he sees the English women as having far greater independence than he would have liked. Therefore, what we are looking at is a transculturation where change is sought in terms of technology, science, and also an autoethnography where a critical look at English society is made, and very carefully a refusal is made to change the selfhood in terms of religion and sexuality. So you see, this is how, Abu Talib becomes both the gazer and the gazed, a subject of Oriental curiosity and a subjecthood of critical transculturation within contemporary Britain. Okay, so that is something which I wanted you to look at, this paradox of both the gazer and the gazed. Now, of course, he talks about his own agenda. Abu Talib is traveling with his personal agenda. When he says, when I first arrived in London, if you look at the end of the page, it had been my determination to have opened a public academy to be patronized by the government for instructing such as the English were destined to fill important situations in the East in the Hindustani. You see, already Haileybury College is being set up. Already there's a mechanism in place so that, company administrators might be trained in Persian. Abu Talib wanted to create a competitive school, which would be a competitor, as it were, to this Haileybury College. But he unfortunately finds that the British have no real inclination to one more academy as such. Now, we were talking about transculturation. And you see how cultural forms are being used in this process of transculturation and in the contact zone. Now, in the Masnavi kind of a poetry, you have the poem which praises the beauty of a woman or a city, right? Now, Abu Talib, and remember, this ode to London, by the way, is written in Persian. So what he's doing is bringing within the Masnavi tradition the ode, which is of a British nature. So you see the transculturation, even within culture, different forms of poetry. Remember that Abu Talib's travelogue is littered with such poems. So he's following the Masnavi tradition of, grafting in poetry on occasions, whenever he's talking about curiosity. But in this particular case, he's bringing in the structure of ode into Masnavi poetry. So you have two kinds of poetry also coming in contact. And you see, what happens is the way in which Abu Talib looks at London. So he sees London as kind of the Noor of Western civilization. And you see, we will devote our lives to London and its heart-alluring damsels. So he's not talking about the Jannat, where you have the Huris. He's talking about an earthly Jannat in London, right? We have no longing for the Toba, Sudra, or the trees of paradise. We are content to rest under the shade of the terrestrial cypresses. It's almost blasphemous in the way he's sort of rejecting the kind of Oriental pleasures and sort of looking at London as the new paradise, as it were. And look at this. If the Sheikh of Mecca is displeased at our conversion, who cares? May the temple which has conferred such blessings on us and its priests flourish. So he's looking to replace, as it were, Mecca with London in that sense of the term. Adorable creatures whose flowering tresses, and he's talking about the London women, the Western women. And see here also, very often within the Oriental discourse, Orientalist discourse, the Oriental is seen as somebody who is libidinous, who radiates sexuality, who's flirtatious, who has polygamy, and so on and so forth. So this idea of the licentious, seductive Oriental despot, right, is a trope that Orientalism created. And in many ways, you see, Abu Talib is catering and pandering to that Oriental prototype. But at the same time, he's suggesting that, he's ready to forsake many of these Muslim pleasures for the pleasures of London, right? So it is here that the transculturation happens, both at the level of selfhood and at the level of genre as well. So, different kinds of poetry are being brought into a state of hybridization, as it were. So I wanted to share that particular ode with you. And you will find that if you read the Travels carefully, such incidents or such, use of such poetry is very frequent in Abu Talib. Right. Now, the other thing that I would like to talk about is the places that, Abu Talib goes to. And there's one more other passage which really needs to be talked about. And I would like to just mention that before I go on to the other segments, as it were. And he talks about, of course, the English parade and the ways in which, he's looked at by the others. This parade is taking place. But there is also this episode, and this is where I would like to come back to, or just fast forward in the Travels, as it were. When Nelson's victory is celebrated, and Nelson is presented with a diamond sword and a banquet, it is there that Abu Talib sits with sits with Nelson on the same seat, and then you can see that the prosperity of Lord Nelson and may the victory of the Nile be even ever remembered. And he talks about Hafiz and the way in which glasses of wine are circulated. But look at this passage then that comes. As many of the persons who were seated at the lower end of the room, he says, could not see the upper table, a petition was sent that may be allowed to pass round the table. When they came opposite to Lord Nelson or me, notice that. That's very interesting, isn't it? That Abu Talib at this point of time is actually a nobody, but he's sitting with Nelson. And therefore, all the nobility of England is courtesying to him, right? So the men stooped their heads and the women bent their knees. This mark of respect, Abu Talib says, they thought due to Lord Nelson. And then he says, and to me, for my supposed high rank. You see, there's a self-consciousness always operating within Abu Talib. He's conscious in many ways that the show that he's putting on is actually the show of a charlatan, as it were. He's no Persian prince, but he's playing the role of the Persian prince. So this awareness of playing a role, and thereby, the sort of kind of honor that he's getting from the British, and that the British are treating him equal to Lord Nelson, makes Abu Talib, or gives him the strength to judge or to pass judgment on the English. So this is quite significantly different from later travelers who are judging the English from a position of inferiority. Abu Talib, on the other hand, is judging English character on a position or on a plane of equality. Right. Now, what are the things that Abu Talib looks at? And that is what I will gradually, talk to you about. Abu Talib, if you take a look at your page 127 of your text, I would invite you to sort of just note these page numbers down so that you can quickly go on to the text. I'm not going to project the entire text. It will take me a humongous amount of time. He talks about the University of Oxford. And at every step, Abu Talib is referring to a particular kind of Indian location. So Oxford University is compared to a Hindu temple of learning. So you see, in terms of learning at least, Abu Talib does not see a great difference between Oxford and the Hindu temple, right? Page 127, however, and this is when Abu Taleb's travelogue tries to identify what makes the British superior to Hindustan at this point of time. And he talks about an anatomy lesson. Now, it's interesting because in subsequent travelogue of Lutfullah, which will be published in 1857, Lutfullah, who is much more educated than Abu Taleb, scientifically educated, will also describe anatomy, medicine, as a kind of science in which the British have moved much ahead of the East. Now, interestingly, Stewart, when he translates the English text, deletes this anatomy lesson, as it were, because for Stewart, this is commonplace. But for Abu Taleb, the anatomy lesson, an entry into the science of the human body, is one of the high points of the travels. So Abu Taleb is quickly coming to terms with the idea that it is science and technology that are setting the Westerner apart. This is something that also throughout the century, Indian travelers will seek. And therefore, the transculturation that happens in 19th century travel writing is in the sphere of technology and science. This claim for modernity, which Abu Taleb very quickly recognizes, is only on the basis of science. Page 128, for example, he talks about the parks of London and the picturesque, right? So he sees London as the paradise primarily because of its parks. And it's this very interesting way in which he sort of describes these locations. Then he talks about the masquerade, which I have already talked to you about. And he talks about the King's Library. Also, this, the English desire to archive knowledge in libraries. And he also talks about, very importantly, the museum, right? And you will find that this is the time when the British Museum is being built, right? And the British Museum, National Institution, building contains nearly 100 apartments, each of which is named from the articles it contains. All nature has been ransacked to procure them. And therefore, he talks at details about the museum in detail. So the desire of the Western civilization to archive knowledge, which is ransacked from all parts of the world, is noted by Abu Taleb. He then moves on to talk about the coffee houses of London. He will later on talk about the coffee houses of Paris as well. He will also talk about the banks and the exchanges of England, the vast cavalry, the army which puts on a parade for him. And he will then move on to identify what is the strength of the British nation. And he will suggest, this is a very important segment, as Mushirul Hasan points out, the great perfection to which the English have brought their navy is doubtless the chief cause of their prosperity and the principal source of all their wealth. By means of their navy, they can at all times send an army to invade the enemy's country. If they succeed, it is well. If not, they can return with little loss. The neighbors, the French, possess an innumerable army of brave troops, but cannot injure the English, who are constantly well protected. The wisdom and the skill manifested by the English in the construction and navigation of their vessels, with the excellent regulations, are beyond my powers to describe. The Mushirul Hasan makes a very interesting point when he says that Abu Taleb is extremely perceptive in locating the power structures of the places that he visits. See, talks about British Parliament, but he does not really describe it. He rather talks about, the merchant, the exchange, the bank, the army, and the navy. Technology which makes Britain great. And he will later on talk about the British East India Company. So Abu Talib, being the Omildar or the tax collector that he was, he is penetrating, many of the institutions of Britain, but his exclusive concern is to understand the nexus between British imperial power and British naval power and British financial power. So there's a kind of triangle that he draws within the travelogue. The seat of power through the army and its regulations and strict discipline, as compared with the centralized army, as compared with the dispersed army of the Mughals, the very carefully built up maritime power of the British versus the relatively poor maritime power of the others colonial states and also of India. And thirdly, the financial institutions and trade and commerce and the interaction between technology and trade that makes Britain so great. So Abu Talib is quickly, the travels is important in the way or in the degree of perception through which Britain's naval powers are, and its imperial, the quality of its imperial power is dissected by Abu Talib. Right, so it's of course going to other areas. It's going to the spinning mill or the jenny, where he's looking at how the British are harnessing, the power of the power of the water and the air in the sake of production of machines and therefore spinning. And you'll remember that it is cotton and silk which becomes the staple export and import of the British nation, right? Therefore, it's quickly identifying the trade and commerce that Britain is engaged in. There's also an episode which, unfortunately, I did not manage to actually capture in this PDF, is when he goes to see the manufacture of small iron pins. And he's looking at the kind of division of labor that is taking place in this factory that sort of manufactures pins. And he's stunned by both the intricacy of the process, the mechanization of the process, and the scale of production that the British can generate. Now, you see, these parts of the travelogue are specifically directed, as I pointed out yesterday, to his Muslim readers who would, and he's suggesting that they need to understand. And you remember that he sort of wanted, or he took back diagrams also of this process, which he could not print because he did not have enough money. So he would like this technology to be transferred to his Persian readers so that they could also replicate and grow with the British. So this part of the travelogue is distinctly therefore written with his Persian travelers in mind. But it's great news for the British also, because the Britishers would advertise this as a symbol of their power and their superior culture. So Abu Talib's travels are circulated by the British, because they see within Abu Talib a kind of a validation of their superiority, right? So Abu Talib's travelogue cuts both ways. It talks about British superiority in technology, but asks his own countrymen to sort of replicate it. On the other hand, the British can see it as a validation of their superiority and therefore as a justification of continued colonial rule. Now, of course, he then talks about the British army of cavalry, infantry, and artillery. He will talk about the guns that the English bring. He will talk about the lights again, very important, They talk about the lights of London and the way in which artificial lighting has sort of created, multiple trading opportunities. Another very interesting thing that he talks about is the fire engines that the British have built to put out the fires in London. And remember, this is the time when fires are almost always every day breaking out over London. So the practical use of water resources, wind resources for the sake of technology is something that Abu Taleb is quickly looking at. Now, I would like to very quickly then go on to another passage. This you will have to read yourselves. Unfortunately, the page got garbled. Abu Taleb is while he's very generous in acknowledging that the British are technically, much more advanced than his Muslim brethren. One of the places where Abu Taleb does not leave a quarter or does not accede to any kind of British superiority is in terms of religion. So there's a passage here in this travelogue where you see sorry, I just missed it, where a priest walks up to him and talks about the irrationality of the Muslim religion and suggests that believing in the one Allah is something which is who is the only God is something that is not rational. And traveling to Mecca to sort of see this kind of the area of Muhammad is something which is irrational. Abu Talib immediately retorts by arguing that if the British can baptize the child with water and consider that to be holy, then they should not talk about the irrationality of the Muslim religion. So in terms of religion, Abu Talib considers that a prohibited area where the British can make any kind of comment. He sees Muslim and British religions as equivalent, if not the Muslim religion being superior. Now, the other thing that I would like to talk about before I wind up this class is Abu Talib's visit to the East India Company. Now, you see, so far he has talked about the superiority of the British in terms of technology, banking, etc., etc. But he quickly recognizes what the space in London of power is. You see, these are spaces that he visits. For example, Windsor Castle, the court of the king and the queen, the factories, the shipyards, the naval dockyards, right? And finally, he comes to the place that has made Britain what it is, the East India Company. And he says in political importance, and note this, the East India Company ranks next to the House of Commons. Company means an association of merchants. So Abu Talib is recognizing that it is not Parliament which is the source of power in England. It is actually the company. And therefore, the capital, he talks about, financial statistics, right? And the ways in which you become a director of the East India Company, 24 directors, 6 of whom go out of office every year, and so on and so forth. A person of very superior understanding and well conversant in all kinds of business. The directors are most esteemed for their abilities. And he talks about Inglis, Scott, and Charles Grant, who would later on frame the policies for India. So the proprietors of East India stock are of all ranks and professions. They attend twice a year in the India House. And he talks about the India House, where you had, this great emblem of the British East India Company and a portrait of the English sort of reigning supreme. is a very extensive and superb building and contains an immense number of apartments for all public offices, right? And he talks about the chairman and the deputy attending there, right? So what I'm trying to suggest here is that Abu Talib's travelogue is an extremely, shrewd travelogue in that sense of the term. Abu Talib quickly recognizes what are the spaces and the practices that make England greater. He sees these spaces as the technological spaces, the factories. He looks at how the English have harnessed knowledge and technology, and how the English have put that to use in maritime warfare, and how they have mastered the art of trade and commerce, and how manufacturing itself becomes an important mainstay in the source of their power. So within this lecture, what we have tried to show, or what we've liked to try to explore, is Abu Talib's perception of England. Now, he has seen very clearly in the contact zone that the English are technologically advanced, and therefore he wants this travelogue to be a record of this superiority, and therefore, ways in which his Muslim brotherhood may come into sort of changing this. On the other hand, he refuses to allow the English any space of superiority in terms of religion or in terms of personal lives and its treatment of women. Now, at the same time, he recognizes that the English are a colonial race and they are perpetrating violence on his nation as well as on Ireland. Therefore, there is a proximity between the Irish and the Indians. And finally, Abu Talib's travelogue is marked by a very ironic self-consciousness, where he realizes that as the Persian prince, he receives great attention and great honor, which he actually does not demand or deserve, because he's not a Persian prince, but he enjoys every moment of it. So it's very interesting to see how the discourse of Orientalism is actually framing Abu Talib, and how Abu Talib is writing back in this discourse of colonialism. So it is with that, therefore, that I come to the end of today's discussion, really. But what I would like to emphasize is in the next session, we will take a look at the most important segment of Abu Talib's text. In the next segment, he will talk about the 12 great defects of the English and the 12 virtues of the English. So that will give us a very, very proper idea of how Abu Talib evaluates British culture. In this section, we've seen Abu Talib as the observant, as the ironic commentator. But in the next segment, we shall see how Abu Talib becomes, or how Abu Talib's autoethnographic mode comes into operation, and how he takes a look, very careful scrutiny of British culture. But I'll leave that for tomorrow. In the meanwhile, I see that there's just one question which is there from Boyjonto. If you want, you can put other questions as well. Boyjonto asks me, in retrospect, does this translated memoir be seen as a piece that has not aged well, considering the rise of nationalist and religious self? Now, that's an interesting question, Boyjonto, because it's true that, Abu Talib's text becomes very popular till the 1830s. And this is the point you see when the Hindu traveler starts traveling to the West. And that creates a different moment of perception, really, because you see, one of the things that happens is that while Muslim travelers did travel to the West, the record of this travel was not very well kept. Whereas when the Hindu travelers travel, they engage in a much sharper and voluminous record of their travels. And with another thing that one notes is that post 1857, and you see, Vajanto, this date becomes very important for us. See, 1857 is the moment when this nationalist consciousness or the consciousness of a national self is, as it were, being provoked by the mutiny. So post 1857, the kind of direction of the travelogue changes, as you very intelligently point out, that there is a discourse where you tend to see it in terms of an argument, an anxiety about modernity, and a strong pitch for nationalism. And of course, there's also this religious sort of self as well. But you see, Abu Taleb's travelogue becomes interesting because some of the major tendencies of all Indian travelogues subsequently written become articulated here. You remember that Partho Chatterjee talks about how the modern Indian selfhood sees itself as divided between the public and the private selves, the home and the world, as it were. So, in the public sphere, you see, the Englishman takes or the Indian acknowledges very often, as Abu Talib did, British power in terms of technology. And almost all Indian travelers note this. Whereas in the Antapur or in the private space of the home, they do not allow this change to happen. Well, Hindu travelers, of course, did, like Rabindranath will, and if you start it next week, you'll find that Rabindranath, when he's traveling, is forcefully arguing with his brother Dijendranath that much more independence needs to be given to the Indian woman. So in that sense, they will probably move out of Abu Talib's trope to a little bit. But this division between the external public world versus the internal world of religion and women is largely a division that I see repeated in many subsequent travelogues, as it were. The other thing you will, of course, remember is that with Macaulay, English becomes the dominant language. So Persian sort of shrinks from the Indian public space to a large extent, right? So when the Bengali will now travel, he will write either in Bangla or he will write it in English. And very frequently, because of a very powerful, Bengali print medium. And that is the difference between, I see, the Hindu and the Muslim divisions of knowledge, as it were. The Hindu, as it were, embraced the world of print culture in a very powerful way. So that you have, and that is where you see the rise of vernacular cultures, regional prints, regional travelogues, and also nationalism provokes a kind of writing in the Bangla language. And Persian is no longer seen as that kind of a pan-Indian language, as it were. So as Persian declines and as English progresses, in response to English, it is no longer Persian. It is, Bangla. And therefore, you see, the way in which the travelogue will now move will be in the Bangla language. And therefore, Mirza Abu Talib's travelogue becomes largely now inaccessible to people. And therefore, it does not age well at all. But you are right in that sense that, in the way that Abu Talib was popular in the 1720s is not something that we see later on. It is only when we talk about the post-colonial discourses that the importance of Abu Talib finds itself prominent. By the way, let me also add that if you are interested, Abu Talib has been resurrected well in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and you have the works of very important scholars like Gulfishan Khan, who will talk about the perceptions uh, of the Muslim travelers who are traveling into Europe, and therefore it comes back in the discourse of the Persian Urdu speaking, as it were, clientele later on in the 20th and the 21st century. Right. So that is in way of responding to your question. Shamarpon has a question which says, is it Abu Talib's brilliance that rather than trying to camouflage and mingle with the British, as done by the majority of the travelers, he tried to keep himself apart and distant from the host culture? No, he did not actually try to be distant from the host culture, as it were. You see, Abu Talib's social ability was probably something that amazes me. I have, of course, not sort of talked about the entire travelogue, but if you take a look at the number of people that he interacts with, then this is mind-boggling. Nobody apart from Rabindranath had actually access to so much of Western nobility. Who are the people he goes and mixes with? The prince, the king. He goes and mixes with Cornwallis, Lord Clive, Dundas. So he's meeting almost all and sundry. And there are numerous visits paid by the entire nobility to Abu Talib. Now, you make one point which could be considered is Abu Talib, being conscious as nobility, is interested only in meeting with the nobility. So there's no great reference to his interaction with a common British citizen. And for him, he's largely an alien. But for the British nobility, Abu Talib becomes that Oriental prince who is this piece of curiosity that must be, interacted with. So, in a certain sense, Abu Talib's sociability is something which amazes me. Now, I've always been very perplexed with the fact how Abu Talib, who was a pauper in India, could go and spend 2.5 years in Britain, given the fact that he says it's extremely expensive to live in Britain as such. But obviously, once he became a celebrity, people offered him money, offered him, gifts. But quickly he realized that this was a novelty that would wear off. And he needed to find, an actual way of earning money. And that is why he wanted that madrasa or that school where he would teach Persian and the other Hindustani languages. But that, of course, did not materialize. So, I would rather say that, he is, mingling with the British in a very, very intimate way, probably with the nobility only, but in a way that very few Indian travelers would get a chance. Now, the other question that you ask is, self-fashioning himself as a celebrity, does he actually make the English exhibit themselves to him on their own, much like a chief? Yes, that is true, in that sense that, he is sanctified by the king, as it were. So he is part and parcel of the court. So now he becomes the kind of a celebrity to the British nobility who come and vie to visit him. Right. In that sense, he would be probably one of the first Indian celebrities who visited England at this point of time. Yes, I agree with you to that extent. But I would also suggest that Abu Talib's degree of familiarity with the British, his capacity for mixing around, and his cosmopolitan sensibilities would be far greater than subsequent travelers. I can only think of Prince Dwarkanath and later on Raja Rammohun Roy, who attracted such great attention from the British who's who, as it were. Right. So I think those were the questions that were put to me. Thank you for those questions. Tomorrow becomes a very important day because we look at the most important segments of Abu Talib's travelogue tomorrow. So with that, I would like to fold up today's session. Thank you for having attended today's lecture, and see you tomorrow at 10:30 once again. Have a very good day, everybody.